Okay. My name is Ida Sapp. I am from South Africa. I'm born and raised there, and I left when I was about 22, which was in 1999.
Oh, perfect, perfect. It's probably a good disclaimer. Just to be safe. So, yeah, how long would you say we've known each other? What year did you and Carla get married? My brother.
2004.
2004. So yeah, so we've probably known each other for, what is that? It's a long time,
Almost
20
19
years
years.
at least. So, yeah. Very, very cool. All right. So I have all of my questions here that my students submitted. If you wouldn't mind, we'll just kind of, I have it broken up into 3 sections like you saw. I have our just general life experiences growing up in South Africa, and then a little bit growing up under apartheid, and then we'll kind of finish up with some life after apartheid, and then some stuff, just the last couple questions to close it out, if that works for you. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Perfect. Perfect, perfect. All right. So Jackson would like to know, just growing up, did you like growing up in South Africa other than apartheid?
Yes, I did actually. I had a lovely childhood.
That's great. And then what was it like? We learned a lot about like the segregation going into apartheid and leading up to it, and about the segregation of schools. So Paulina would like to know what it was like to go to an all-white school.
You know, it's all I knew. All the schools were segregated. It's all I knew. So it was just honestly, it's a lot like the schools here. Most of the schools are it's not segregated, but it's not super diverse, at least in Utah, just depending on the demographic of the area. But it's not something I ever thought about. I was just a child, so I never actually gave it a second thought. It
Yeah.
was just normal.
Yeah, you're just a kid going through life. Yeah, I totally understand that. And then through our book, we learned about all the native languages for South Africa. There's 11 native languages.
Yeah.
What Camden would like to know if you learned any of the other different languages of South Africa.
I actually spoke Nama, which is not one of our native languages, until I was about 4, where we moved out of the area. And then I kind of lost it because when you stop speaking a language when you're that little, you forget all of it. But I only speak my native tongue, which is Afrikaans, and then English. And then because we have so many native languages, we have South African English has a lot of words borrowed from other languages that is as part of our vernacular. That South Africans can have a whole conversation in English and people from other countries might not understand because there are so many borrowed words from the other languages. So that I can speak.
Mm. Oh yeah, that's really interesting because it seems there's probably just so many of those different languages around. Like you just pick it up and it's just a part of your everyday vernacular and the words that you use.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I also, let's see, I have a question from Noah here. What was the food like? And then he says, I asked this because there's so many different cultures living there in South Africa, and he wonders if it's good or bad.
South African food is well known for being very good. South Africans, no matter which culture they're from, when they move out of the country, they always complain about the food in other countries, especially if they move to America or Europe. If they move to Asia, it's better. We actually have, not just because of our own culture, but because of being part of colonization, we have lots of influences like from Asia as well in our food. But then also the African influence. We eat a lot of meat, and we kind of share, like we share our cuisine. So everybody knows how to cook just about everything from other cultures. Yeah. It's lovely. Food is so good.
Sounds delicious. Sounds so good. Uh, and then, what is Jane would like to know what the weather in train was like?
The weather, the weather is great all year round. We have
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
we have about 12 weeks of winter about, but it's very mild. It is like we still go out, like you go outside, there's no snow. The kids still play sports, people still wear shorts. It's a little bit like probably Central or Southern California. Just depending also where you are. Some parts are warmer and some parts are colder during the winter. Our summers are very, very hot in most
Mm,
parts. Yeah.
okay. And then what were your hobbies growing up? I've got a lot of my students who like hunting and fishing, outdoor activities. So Kyler and Nathan would like to know if you did any hunting or fishing, or what your hobbies were when you were growing up.
I did not. In fact, I think I went fishing once or twice. Hunting is not as easy to do in South Africa as it is in the US. You have to go hunt on a farm, on a game farm, and that could be very expensive. You cannot just hunt on public land. Um, but my father did go on hunting trips. But I rode my bike and I read books and I swam and spent time with my friends and did sport. Yeah.
So just standard kid stuff. And then
Yeah.
kind of the last question, wrapping up this the life experience growing up in South Africa. Megan would like to know, and I don't know if we said off the top, but you did mention Utah. You live in Utah now. How different was life there to where you are now? So how different was life in South Africa to where you are now living in Utah?
So the first thing is with regards to schools is we wore school uniforms. Um, every school had a uniform and colors. Um, so that is one thing. It's much colder here in Utah. It's a lot less diverse, a lot less culturally diverse, obviously. It's a lot more affluent here. Like people have a lot more money. There's quite a bit of poverty in South Africa. Due to segregation and oppression, there are big parts of the population that did not have the opportunities that many other people had. Yeah, it's a lot more relaxed, I think, in South Africa, and people are a lot more. They have a different vibe. So it's different in that way. It's a lot more relaxed, a lot more noisy. People will just sometimes start dancing in the street. Yeah. So just depending on if there's music, somebody's going to be dancing. Yeah.
Oh, that was cool. And we read, just remembering, we read a little bit about the townships and how there's just constantly music playing everywhere, and then people dancing in the street, parties going on, different stuff. Was that pretty common in the areas where you grew up as well? Or is that more so now that apartheid has ended and stuff is?
Yeah, it's a little bit more so now, but even when I was growing up, they would always be town would be noisy. When you go to town is noisy. There's music playing at the stores. Um, or at the taxi ranks where because a lot of people didn't have cars, so they would use what we call taxis, which is mini buses. There would be lots of music. People speak louder as well. But then the other thing is we would one of the things that's very different is we buy things on the street. So which you don't see here. It's actually quite common in many other parts of the world, but you buy fruit and vegetables on the street or crafts that people make. You can buy furniture on the street. You can buy fish out of the back of somebody's truck on the street. So there's more noise just because of that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. That sounds so interesting. And then you had to kind of go into like growing up where you did and under while apartheid was coming down. What if you remember back as a kid, maybe maybe not early on because, like you said, you were just that's what you were raised in, so that's all you really knew. But as like maybe you're hitting middle school, the age of my kids in seventh grade, or into high school, what were your feelings? And Melee asked this. What were your feelings sort of apartheid?
Seventh grade, if you have not been exposed to anything else and you've never thought about anything else, and all the adults around you and all the structures that you are exposed to, so whether it's church or government or businesses, this is something that is kind of entrenched in all of them. Everywhere you go, you saw, like, we had different entrances at the post office for whites and non-whites. They would say that whites only, non-whites, and there would be different lines in the post office. Different doctors, different hospitals. We did not share anything. There was very little that we were sharing. Different transportation. We never took the same buses. Yeah, so in that sense, you don't think about it really. When I was in seventh grade, was in 1989, was probably the beginning of negotiations. Negotiations that started a little earlier, but this was more the beginning of formal negotiations. To start ending apartheid. So we were more aware of it. Until that point, there were lots of unrests and strikes and so on. So I was aware of that. And the influence that that had on our lives, which was more just a sense of uncertainty and some fearfulness. But then during the end of apartheid, it was not, we didn't, it was, remember, it was before the internet, so we couldn't just go search for information. So we lived under censorship, so books were banned that were against the government or that were seen against the government. I think 1984, that book was, I think, as far as I remember, banned. There were lots of banned books. So we couldn't find the information to really know what was going on. And the people who knew what was going on was hiding it very well, other than, of course, the obviously seeing that people were not being treated the way that we were treated.
Yeah.
But even that, even adults have like, psychologically, we are kind of wired to think that people who are not the same as us have something wrong with them. We create these in and out groups. So as a child, you just go with what the adults around you do. It takes quite a bit. I think all of us think, oh, I will do the right thing, but it takes quite a bit to be able to do the right thing. Yeah, so you kind of went with what your parents said. So we would hear the adults talk about, with the referendum in 1992, are you going to vote for the referendum or for the negotiations or against the negotiations? I mean, we didn't have it as children an option, but we also didn't really know what was going on. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that would be, I think that would be a tough position to be in as a kid, because you're taking in everything from your parents and from those people that you feel. So you're going to have the thoughts and the views that you do, and you may not even, you're not really thinking about anything other than that. I think that probably gets into the next question from Kate, and she asked, did you ever get told, like during negotiations and when they're talking about, they're coming to the table to try to figure out how to end apartheid, were you ever told propaganda about other races?
Oh, yeah. We were told propaganda from the beginning. There was a lot of talk about communism and the threat of communism, which is interesting because that still happens pretty much in a lot of countries in the world, and how information about communism was used to direct how we thought about a certain people group, whether those people had anything to do with communism or not. So we were also, because of some of the things that happened after colonialism and even during colonialism in Africa, a lot of that was presented as Black people will try and destroy the white people in Africa. So there was a lot of fear that was from the beginning. From the time I was very little, I was very aware of that. we did bomb drills all the time in school. I think like how your parents, Stephen, your parents' age people in America did for the Cold War. We
Yeah.
did bomb drills, and there were actually some instances of bombs going off in my childhood during the struggle, not where I lived, but in other places. So yes, there was a lot of propaganda, and it was propaganda sometimes very subtle because you are shown, like on the news, we would see a lot of footage of the unrests, but we wouldn't see footage of the police assaulting the people who were striking or who were rioting. And I think it's a good thing to remember when you see footage from your own country, from any other country. It's very easy to come to a conclusion and not actually know what is really going on, even if you're there sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And with my kids, we talk about perceptual positions and being able to look at something from your perspective, from someone else's, and then a neutral perspective. And so, Abby had a question about during apartheid, were you fully aware of what was happening? And it sounds like, from what you're saying, that you were aware of what you were told.
Yeah.
Would you say that's correct, or you're kind of aware of what's going on around you to the effect of the people want you to know, to those in power want you to know?
Yeah, you were aware of what was going on to the extent that what those in power wanted you to know. There was also there was a real cost to knowing more. So even for the adults, I've had these conversations with my parents. Even for the adults, they had a vested interest in not knowing because you would lose your job at the least. There were a lot of white people under house arrest because they were part of the struggle, they were protesting the government oppression of Black people or anybody who wasn't white. There were people um, of all races who were assassinated by the government, by the secret police. And a lot of that came out in the late 90s during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where a lot of these people applied for amnesty. And then we would hear the stories of how people were killed under interrogation. Steve Biko was one of them. And there was a movie about Steve Biko done in the
Oh my
80s. I
gosh.
think Washington
Yeah.
played. So we only heard about all of those later, and the people who were involved with it obviously were not forthcoming about how bad it was, but then also adults who could um, did not ask any questions. Like I had a family member in the secret police, and it's just not something you spoke about. You didn't speak about their work.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And then what's that like then? I know I'm getting kind of off topic here, but that's so interesting to me. What's that like now, looking back? Do you have connections with that person? Do you have contact? How does your family talk about them, if at all, if they're still around?
They are still around. It's very ironic because he can speak, from what I remember, he can speak a Black language, which is part of why he was in the secret police. But
Yeah.
he had left the police shortly after freedom, and maybe even before. He had started a business, and a lot of his business partners are Black people. Um, the reality is that in a place like South Africa, a lot of there was almost a conscious decision for a lot of people, obviously not everybody, there's still a lot of anger on both sides. Um, but to be able to move the country forward, a lot of people decided that that was then, and now we need to move forward. And the Truth and Reconciliation really helped because we did speak about a lot of what happened, and everybody then knew. It wasn't just, oh, that's just stories that you made up about the old government. Is everybody, white and Black, everybody heard about exactly what happened under the old government and how brutal it was and how oppressive and how violent it was. So then it kind of helped all of us to say, okay, we need to move forward to something, or at least try. So a lot of people, you know, things about people and you just move on. Yeah.
I think that's super important for my students to hear is that uh, from and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing too much, but you put those things out in the open, you deal with the things once they're out in the open, and then you say, hey, this was terrible, and then you try to take those steps to move on. I think
Yeah.
I think when we try to hide things, and I tell my kids all the time, like, if you're playing a game on your Chromebook and I say, hey, knock it off, all you gotta say is, yep, my bad, you own your mistake, you own whatever it is. Like, yeah, I didn't do my homework. Yes, I didn't. You own it, and then we deal with it, and then you move on. So it seems like that was kind of a pattern that happened in South Africa on a much larger scale.
Yeah, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Tutu wrote he wrote a book called No Freedom Without Forgiveness, and he was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the whole premise of the thing was none of us could be free if there's not forgiveness for what has happened, but there cannot be forgiveness if there's not honesty. And that honesty comes from courage. And to not be honest about what happened is not courageous. And then that it's like a zombie, it will always come back to harm you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's so good, Ida. That's so good. And then I've got a couple, like a trio of questions here. I'm going to see if I can roll them into one from Olivia, Ruth, and Rose. Just about what the restrictions were like where you were growing up. Did you see like rules and control? And then because of that, did you have any friends that were colored or black?
No, I didn't have any friends who were not white. I had friends who grew up on farms and they would have friends who were black or colored, depending on where they were growing up. But then when they went to school, they would go to separate schools, which they would speak about how traumatizing that was for them as children, that their friends couldn't go to school with them and that they had never thought that there was anything different. And that was a first understanding of apartheid. I actually we always had somebody work in our house. This is very common in South Africa at that time, that a black woman would normally work in your house. And admittedly, we did not treat the people working in our houses as, like, I almost treated the people as a child. I treated the adults who worked in our house as peers rather than as adults, like people with wisdom and insight and who are supposed to discipline me. And that was very common. Even some of the television shows now about that time would present it like this was how disrespectful that was, that children would treat adults like children, like their peers. And yeah, so I did not have any friends from any other cultures until I was 19.
Okay. Perfect. All right, Ida, welcome back. We're going to pick up, hopefully, this seems like already the audio might be a little bit better. So maybe we should have started this way the first time, but alas, this is where we'll do. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into it. We're talking about where we left off growing up under apartheid and some of the things about growing up under apartheid for you and what your experience was like. So I have a question here from Brie Lynn, and she asked, was it tough for you to see what was happening and not be able to do much about it?
Honestly, it's not something I ever thought about. I think, like we've touched on yesterday, this was our normal. The thing is, when you benefit from the oppression, you very rarely question the oppression. The adults around me didn't even question it. I definitely did not think about questioning it. There was not much that would prompt that for me. Even with the unrest and the violence, I never questioned what it was about. I just knew there was unrest and violence. So I think that answers it in the sense that I didn't necessarily feel that I was supposed to do something about
Yeah.
it. And that's the thing about these systems, right? Or often we find ourselves in situations where afterwards you can say, why did I not do something about it? But often we don't even know what we don't know. And we don't think to question the things that we just accept as normal and right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I talked with my students, we talked about that a little bit because we do Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And we talk about how the people in power are going to do what they can to stay in power. So they're not telling you what's really going on, and you're not knowing that you're not doing anything because it's just a system, and the people in power are going to stay in power, and it's there unless they're actively pushed, nothing's going to change. So
yeah and I think in these systems the leaders often make a very good example of the people who try to oppose the system. And so even obviously a lot of Black people were really punished, killed, put in jail, but a lot of white people were the white people who did say this is not okay, some of them were banned. They had to leave the country and they couldn't come back on fear of being imprisoned. Some were killed. There were some really bad situations. There were some really sad stories about it. So that then also now you have to overcome not just the way the world is already and the unpredictability of what will it be if I change it, but then also what could happen to me and my family if I would oppose this.
Yeah, and I think we saw just a piece of that in our book because it talks about Trevor's dad and how he had opened up a restaurant that served both white and Black people, and how it got to a point where they were saying, well, you have a special license, but now we're going to give you all these laws. And they go in and they try to get it for cleanliness. And it's like, well, I'm Swiss. Like, you don't know what, like, this is my jam. Like, it's going to be clean. And so finally they just said, well, you need separate facilities for every single person. You need a bathroom for whites, for Blacks, for coloreds, for the Indians. And you said, well, it's just be a restaurant full of bathrooms then. So I think, I think that goes along pretty awesome with what you're saying. Now, I've got two questions here from Mr. Rulo and then Sierra, and I'm going to kind of group them together. Did you have friends who were supportive of apartheid and also family members possibly who agreed with some of the policies of apartheid?
Yes, everybody I knew agreed with it. Like I said, I think in yesterday's interview, I had a family member in the secret police, and then I cannot remember if I had this conversation with you, but there was conscription. So most of the kids my age, a little bit older, the boys were conscripted into the army.
And just so all my kids know, that is forced military service, correct?
Yes.
Like 1 year of forced military service? Yeah.
It was 1 year after Nelson Mandela was released. Before that, it was 2 years.
Okay.
And I just grew up with that. That was just a normal thing. Boys went to the army. So my father actually fought in that war as well. And it's complicated. Wars are always complicated, but it really was, a big part of it was to support the apartheid system.
Yeah. So it was, I think it'd be really hard not to be touched by it, especially growing up in a community of people that are the ones in power. Of course, you're going to have all those people around you who are supportive of it. And then and I think we might have touched on it a little bit when we were talking about your housekeeper, but was there ever a point where you believed the Blacks were lesser because of the views of the people around you, just because that's the system you're growing up in?
If this is, and the other thing that sometimes strikes me as similar as the US is really this idea of manifest destiny. The Afrikaans people who were in power, and I'm Afrikaans, really believed that they were God's chosen people and that God favored them, and that it was their mandate to control the country and to make sure that everybody believed what they believed and lived how they wanted them to live. And I sometimes find that that's the most dangerous, when you believe not only that you're right, but that God wants you to do this thing that's actually quite evil. That could be really harmful because then you're not open for input and change. So I grew up in the church, and I because we had a national, like a government church. So the church was the instrument of apartheid. The church I grew up under, I'm not speaking about
Yeah.
Christianity in
Yes.
general. But the Dutch Reformed Church that I grew up under was the government church. And I grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church, which actually a lot of people were in the Dutch Reformed Church because when you applied for a job, you had to say which church you belonged to. And
Wow.
belonging to the government church helped you get a better job. So I grew up under that, and I went to church and learned all these things about how we were God's chosen people and how it was important that apartheid was actually God's will.
Wow.
So it's not something that you question when you really believe not only is it my parents and the leaders, God also wants it this way.
Wow. So yeah, why would you ever think differently if you're
Yeah.
holding this belief system and then it's like, well, God says so. So, you know, what could possibly
Right.
be wrong about it?
Right.
This is what is good and what is right. And then this is definitely a gear shift. But actually, this question's from Mr. Sapp. But Trevor said that he lived in a white community, and when he moved with his mom and with his stepdad Abel, but he said it was like living in a prison because everyone was hiding behind maximum security fences in these white communities because they were trying to protect themselves. So, what was your experience with that? Were you in a city? Were you out in the country more?
We were out in a small town.
Okay.
So I've never lived. Oh, that's not true. When I was very young, I lived in a city, but that was quite different. I don't remember much about that. And even then, we lived in a suburb. So more on the outskirts of the city. But I never lived in a city where it was that dangerous. Although now, there are a lot of gated communities and they're fenced in because there's a very high level of unemployment. That's the result of suppressing the biggest part of the population and keeping them from being able to study and get good jobs. People tend to get poor when they cannot work. So there's, I think, 30% unemployment, and there's a lot of crime, and there's a lot of fear.
Wow.
So there is a lot of violence. Yeah, and obviously, you don't. When people have benefited generation after generation, like Black people couldn't own land, they couldn't own farms, they couldn't buy houses wherever they wanted. It was actually quite limited where they bought houses. They couldn't move around freely. We had passed laws. So until 1986, people couldn't go where they wanted to go. But all of that to say, white people had many generations of being able to make money and pass it on to their children. So it's traditionally white communities that are often, if you want to go steal something, you don't go to the poor person's house, you go to a richer house, right? You don't go to the house that doesn't have a TV, you go to the house that has a big TV.
Yes. Yes, that makes total sense. And then did you, like, I know it was a slow process, apartheid coming down, but did you expect it to fall? Was that just kind of an understanding? Lizzie asked if you expected apartheid to fall, and were you surprised when finally the whole system crumbled?
I think for me as a child, again, didn't really think about what would happen or didn't even know there was a system. This was just life.
Yeah.
But I was in middle school, I was in middle school when Nelson Mandela was released, so I knew that things were changing. Didn't know what that meant. We didn't learn about it in school because I was still under apartheid. So our teacher didn't say, "What do you think about Nelson Mandela being released?" Because we were censored, so we couldn't speak about anything like that. But then I think I started becoming more aware, definitely when I was about in 8th grade, realizing, okay, things are changing very fast, and not that the world that I will be an adult in would be different than the world my parents grew up in, or even the world I grew up in. But you cannot possibly imagine it. It's like only having lived in black and white, and now you have to imagine color. You don't know what that means.
Yeah, it's just completely new experience. Like no possible idea. And then moving into now kind of some questions about life after apartheid. I have two of them here I'm combining from Katie and Olivia. And Katie asked if you were relieved when it was over, and then Olivia was asked, did you see things that permanently changed in your life or in your city?
Yeah. I think, let me start with the relieved.
Yeah.
I think when I was older and I realized what apartheid was and what it meant, I was definitely relieved. There was also getting to know then Black and colored and Indian friends hearing their stories and realizing just how unequal and unfair it was, and really how easy my life was.
Yeah.
It was, there was a lot of shame that my people did that to other people, especially now. It's just true that when we get to know somebody, they become a person, right? Otherwise, they're not really emotionally important to us. But when you get to know someone and you get to know their stories, and you get to know their parents, and you realize, oh wow, these people really suffered at the hands of my people. There's a lot of regret and shame there as well, and disgust during some of the stories of torture. Then with how things have changed, I think one thing, obviously everything changed. Schools became mixed. There were no more separate facilities, separate anything, like everything was mixed. You started to see more and more people of color having positions, the jobs that wouldn't have been available to them before. And then there was a lot that had to be talked through. What does it mean now when all of a sudden universities are mixed? What does that mean? Because now what does it mean for languages as well? And how do we accommodate different traditions, especially because one religion was it was the state religion, and there wasn't any allowance for anything else. But now we had religious freedom because we had freedom in general. So how do you allow people to express themselves? That was a lot of conversation around that. But one very practical thing for me, because I left South Africa when I was probably about 22, I moved overseas. And one time when I was back visiting, we were stuck in traffic on I guess you guys call on the freeway, equivalent of a freeway in South Africa. And the traffic was moving very slowly. And I was just, as you do, looking around, and I realized, wow, there's a lot of cars with Black drivers. And that was just something that was so different than my childhood, because, well, people weren't allowed to have good jobs that could make them good money so that they could actually afford a car. And it just felt good. It felt right.
Yeah. To look around and see, like, wait, now you're getting a clear picture of everyone who lives in South Africa. You're not just getting
because that's important to remember. White people are the minority.
We learned like 15%. Do you think that number still holds true?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think it's about right. Yeah.
So you would, I would imagine seeing that shift going back and say, wait, now I'm actually seeing everyone who lives here.
Yes, much better represented. Yeah.
All right. And then I'm combining another two from Grayson Bruner, and then also from Jackson. Was it a huge relief to be able to be with people you want? And did you see people of different cultures? So I'm guessing, like you just said, you started to see some people from different cultures, and then having that freedom for them to move here and there and you to move there and there, was that a bit of a relief?
Yeah. Because before it was illegal. You couldn't really go to Black people's homes, and Black people couldn't come to your house unless they were working. You couldn't have been in the same churches or so. It was a relief, especially when I started getting to know Black and colored and Indian people. It was like, oh, there's so much that I missed out on. Like, first I could have learned another language, actually. And then there was so much. Even colored people, a lot of my colored friends they speak Afrikaans. But the way that they just live life is very different, and was so fun. It was so fun to start to get to know different ways of life, and different ways of even using my own language. And then just, we have different ways of approaching life, and I feel like I became a wiser, richer person because of my friends from other cultures.
Because this maybe deviate a little bit, but I would assume just growing up the way you did was a very, kind of a structured way where they were living under the rule or oppression of this system. So maybe they skirted around some of the rules, or they like were a little more willing to take risks, or have like do things that were out of the ordinary or out of the normal. So
it was definitely and I think you see that in South Africa now. I mean, there's cross-racial marriages, and there's everybody is friends, and
Yeah.
in neighborhoods people live together, and there's a lot of tension to have to work through all the time. And I think South Africans become really good at handling tension and not taking that personally, because they have to. Because if you're offended, if somebody offends you, you'll be offended all the time, because the cultures are so different. So having to have grace for other people, and then also just, it's just so much more fun.
Yeah.
So much, Black cultures are so much more vibrant, and they dance and they have music, and it's
And
great.
it is crazy to think, in the face of all the hardship and the hard things that they've been through as a people, that's like their operating systems. They've had to find that joy. So let's go into, did you travel or have any, like, I know travel was pretty limited, but did you ever travel into segregated parts before it ended, and then maybe similar parts after it ended? Was there a difference that you saw in between segregated areas? Like, I'm thinking townships or homelands,
Yeah.
any of those places.
Homelands, I feel like I traveled through maybe Ciskei at some point, which is in the Eastern Cape, which it's not heavily populated, but it was quite remote. I didn't travel that much to homelands or anything as a child.
Why would you have? Yeah.
They're very remote. They were, and that's really the point. It was all the people were crammed into these places because of the laws. The mothers would go work in the cities, and they would have to leave their children behind with their grandparents, because the children were not allowed to live in the cities with them. Like, Black children were not allowed to live in the white cities. So if you can just imagine that, we did as a child sometimes go into, those were not specifically townships. Those were what we call locations. So there were specific places where Black people were allowed to live. A township is more of an informal settlement. At that time, especially during the unrest and then the taxi riots in the 90s, it wasn't safe to go often, but sometimes we would go drop off our housekeeper or something. But then later, and in the late 90s, I had an opportunity to actually stay in a location at somebody's house, and I actually really liked it.
Yeah.
It was just, I was just so surprised how much people could create out of very little, and how incredibly clean the homes were. It was because I knew how hard the people worked and how little time they spent at home. And that they would have a house made out of corrugated iron and no running water, and it would be spotless. And they would have to bring the water from 200 meters away. Or it was a good experience.
I bet. And after it ended, after apartheid ended, Elizabeth would like to know, did you ever look back and wonder how much different your life would have been if apartheid was not a thing? Was that ever something that crossed your mind?
Yes, all the time. Not only do I wonder how different my life would have been, I do wonder how different my country would be now. Because when there is so much pain, there is a lot of anger. Even though we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's still a lot of, and racism doesn't disappear overnight. There's still a lot of racist people, and there's still a lot of anger. And I wonder, I had this conversation with my father about, if their generation started allowing people to go to school, or I was like, you didn't have to change anything, but if you changed that, it would have been so different. Because then when South Africa became a free country, there would have been so many educated Black people, because they would have been able, I wonder how many very smart people never got to go to university, and how much they could have contributed to the future of my country. And I wonder also about what the contribution could have been to the world. There's this, and then my own personal life would have been very different. I would have learned different languages. I would have had a much wider experience of traveling. I
think that's it's tough for me to formulate from that, because that is really heavy, and that because it's more than just your own personal experience. It's the way that it's impacting everyone around you, and you see when certain people are just acting as a part of a system,
Yeah.
And you don't have enough of them questioning the system or saying, hey, this benefits me, but it's not benefiting everyone.
Yeah.
You just fall in line, and then you get 300 years down the road, and then you look back and there's that sense of mourning because you're saying, hey, there's our country could have been so much different. It
Yes,
could have.
especially because now there's so much unemployment.
Mhm.
There's a lot of violence. A lot of people have to leave. And I've never met a South African who doesn't miss South Africa and wish that they didn't have to leave. And um, I think it's ironic because our parents didn't want to change and their parents didn't want to change. Now we had to leave because
Mhm.
it wasn't work for us or it
Yeah.
wasn't um, or a lot of people my age leave because they feel that there's not a future for their children because there
Mhm.
isn't a lot of work and
Yeah.
South Africa is an incredibly rich country with regards to resources and um, really creativity and the ability to make things happen. Um, yeah, so that need to hold on to power ruins your children and your grandchildren's lives.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. Um, yeah. So, sorry. It's tough for me. Like that just puts so much into my head, in terms of how we can, as members of a privileged place. Like I feel like I talk about this with my kids a lot. Like we live in a place in North Idaho where we look around and pretty much everyone looks like us.
Mm,
So what is, obviously there isn't the minute systems like apartheid had, but what steps can we take to make sure we're not looking back in 20, 30 years? Like what
mm,
things can we question to make sure we're not looking back and saying, hey, I could have done that differently, or I could have given this more time. And I think it's simple, and
yeah,
it starts with just your life, like even something as basic as sports teams, and saying, hey, like they're different teams, they're in group, out group, they're making fun of people because of the way they dress, they're looking down on people,
yeah,
and not giving
yeah,
people the empathy from the start, and the feeling of, hey, I can relate to you, we're in this together. We may like different things, we may look at the world
yeah.
differently, but we're in this together. How can we make it a better place?
You know what is interesting now that is so different than when I grew up? Well, first of all, there's not censorship in America,
Yeah.
which really helps.
Yeah.
But with the internet and Netflix and Amazon Prime, you can watch TV shows
Mm-hmm.
with only Indian people in America. It doesn't even have to be about India, but and it could be for a comedy and it just makes us realize, oh, they have the same struggles than we do. They just wear different clothes. Or, oh, their parents annoy them too. Or their children drive them crazy. Or
Mm.
their cars break down. It's the same thing. And realize that our humor is actually quite similar. Or, um, a silly thing you can do is instead of going to McDonald's or Chick-fil-A, go to a Thai restaurant or go to a Chinese restaurant or um, buy something that you wouldn't, even if you're like, this is gross, I don't like it, at least you try.
Mm-hmm.
Because keeps it keeps expanding our minds or
Yeah.
just listening to music from another culture, like listen to some African music. Just even if you're like, I never want to go visit Africa, but listen to the music and realize and just think, wow, this is somebody like my dad playing this drum. Um, it's a lot harder in America because the country is so big, it's hard to travel
Yes. Yes.
outside of the
Mm-hmm.
country. Um, and it's also hard when you live in a place like Utah
Yeah.
or Idaho to easily find people who are different than you.
Yeah.
Um, but I think then what you can do in those situations is to always to especially think about the things that you know is right and ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? How would
Mm.
that change everything if I'm wrong? Or if you have especially if you have an opinion about other people, then to think, well, what if I'm wrong? What if that was me? How would I feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's perfect. I really do. I think having that mindset, and I talk with my kids, and you guys will know this a lot. I talk with you about that frog in a well who's looking up at the
Mm,
top of the well and only sees that small little bit, and the whole time, like that, for that frog, that's all that exists, is perfectly happy.
mm,
And what we do to jump out of that well, to expand the things that we're looking at, our worldview, is we read stories like Trevor Noah. We listen to
yeah,
interviews with people like Ida. We go and we search out people with views or opinions different than our own, or experiences different than our own. Maybe see if we can gain perspective from them. And I think what you said along those lines, Ida, is perfect. And so with that, I would like to kind of know towards the end here, did your experience living under apartheid change your life?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how would you feel looking at your life now? How did you, what effects do you feel like that it played on you? That was from
Well,
Colton. I want to make sure that was from Colton. I don't know if I said it, but Colton, that's that one.
Yeah. One thing, when I was maybe 20, a good friend of mine, also a white friend, turned to me and she said, you know, when you know your parents had cancer and your grandparents had cancer, you don't miss your checkups. You go to your checkups, you eat well, you exercise, you sleep, you take care of yourself. And she's, because you have cancer in your family. And she said, or cancer in your DNA.
Yeah.
She said, we have, as white Afrikaners, we have racism in our DNA. She said, you don't miss your checkups. You watch your thoughts. You consider, you have to bring in those questions. Like, is it you have to constantly question, is it really right? Like the things, especially the things you hold on the tightest. And maybe that's something we just need to do. Every group maybe has to do that. But I think in that sense, that's something, the fingerprints of apartheid is really strong on me, that I have to always be aware that it's like a disease. It's not just gone. It can come back. And I have to always be open-minded, because it's not just about racism. That sense of, I know the right thing, and the pride of that can really show up in other places as well. I think it did make me, especially because it changed in South Africa at a very important time in my life. I was 1 year too young to vote, but I was old enough to understand quite a bit.
Yeah.
And just seeing how the country changed and being very aware of the before. I was old enough to remember the before, and then old enough to, and young enough to be flexible in the after. But just realizing how little I had of cultural exposure, and then how rich it was when I did get to know people. It's something I seek out now. I had the benefit of being scared of other people, because it's not just, we didn't just think we were better. We were scared. That comes from being scared. We're scared of Black people. You were scared of colored people. We're scared of Indian people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we were told they're just more violent than us. They don't understand as much as us. So I was scared. And then to realize, oh, I'm not really scared of Black people. They're just normal people. Or I'm not really scared of colored people. And then realizing, as a matter of fact, me being scared kept me from learning so much. I got to know so many older people who were wise, very wise, and that taught me some of the most important things in my life. And I think that made me sensitive to seeking out people who are different than me, because I know the difference between not having it and then having it. That's something that I would encourage. It's hard. It's hard when you're in a place where there isn't a lot of diversity, but there are books and television shows and documentaries. But to seek out other cultures, and that it could really be fun. It's not just, oh, you can learn so much. It's super fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're putting yourself on the line. You're having that experience where, hey, I feel uncomfortable, and then because you're uncomfortable, you're ready to learn, or you're ready to change, or you're ready to see a different experience. And I think I do that with my kids a lot. I'll have kids and who will come and say, hey, I'm scared, I'm going to bomb this test. And it's like, well, with that attitude, absolutely. Like, I would be surprised if you do well. But if we try to change that scared to, hey, I might bomb it, I might not, it's going to be okay no matter what. You put yourself out there, you say, hey, this may be someone who looks different than me, that talks different than me. You're putting yourself out there. This may be an author who I don't really understand, but you're putting yourself out there to read these things. Then it's, and that's where in my opinion, that's where the magic happens, because you're that little bit of uncomfortable, and that's where you really can learn a lot.
And even, it translates to the rest of your life. If you are willing to be a little bit of uncomfortable, and risk something that might make you nervous, and there's opportunities that can come from it, not just because you are willing to work with or learn from people who are different than you, but you are willing to step outside of what is comfortable for you. And then it can really lead to interesting places and fun places and places that can be rewarding and even financially be
Yes.
rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then if you want, because that is also good in it. And if you could just boil that down to maybe 2 or 3 life lessons that you learned from apartheid, like just quick hitters that we could maybe put up on an anchor chart that I could hang in my room for kids to read.
I think always question what you think you know.
Very good.
Different isn't wrong, it's only different. I think that is I still have to learn that every day, especially because my kids are very different than me.
Yeah.
To have to remember we're doing things different, but it's not wrong. A last one. Well, there's 2.
Yeah, that's 2 is good. 2 is good. We'll have both those down. I'll put them on the whiteboard. 2 is perfect. And then what Tessa had a question. If you could have done anything differently, what would you have done?
You know what? The first thing that comes to mind is I would have learned a different language. I would have learned, we had Black women in our house all the time. I would have said, can you teach me how to speak and learn a different language? I speak a few languages, and what I realize is I'm a different person in every language.
Wow.
And I discover something about myself. When I learned Chinese, I discovered something about myself that I didn't know. There was like, all of a sudden, sorry, it's an alarm. All of a sudden, I found something about myself that I didn't know. I would always encourage anybody anywhere to learn another language. It's not for the sake of just talking to other people. It's for the sake of getting to know yourself better.
Yeah, I think I should learn another language now. I really do. And then to wrap it all up, what advice would you give my class, these 7th graders, based on your experiences?
Trust people. Most people are good. Most people, I think there are bad guys. We all know that, but we hyper focus on that. And it's not just because the media speaks about it or the news or our murder shows, but because our brains are built to be scared and to know that most of the time people want to help you. People want to be kind and to trust that. And that will help a lot with being willing to do something you're uncomfortable for. Most people are cheering at you, like for you to be able to do the thing you want to do.
I think you hit me right there, because I will say I'm a cynic, and forget that just means I have a hard time like trusting off the bat. I just think everyone's intentions are bad. But I think that's great advice, especially for all of my kids, especially. But I'm going to use that too, because it is so easy just to write everyone off and say, hey, well, because if you keep them out there, you keep them at arm's length, then you make sure that you're safe, right?
Yeah.
If you say, hey, you stay over there, I don't fully trust you, that protects yourself. And I talk about that a lot, because I talk, and I want to make sure I can wrap this up, but we do talk about Walt, my dad, who passed away a lot, and how I've learned to welcome the sadness in and welcome in the pain and the hard things, because it makes you feel things, and then you can understand how deeply you've loved because of how deeply you hurt. And I think applying that to other people and recognizing, hey, I may want to feel safe, and I may want to keep people at an arm's length, but if I'm willing to open myself up and accept them in, that will most definitely show me something about myself.
Yeah. And I think in that, if you can trust that even if people offend you, most of the time they're more likely to be clueless than mean. They're more likely to just don't even know that they are hurting you or offending you. And that if you say, hey, that hurt, you can create an opportunity for deepening a friendship rather than being like, you're such a jerk.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is something we fall into so easy. Well, thank you so much, Ida. I
pleasure.
really, really appreciate it. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you so